Ever wonder how software developers make sure those apps you use every day are actually secure?
Right. How do they build security into the process?
Yeah, exactly. So that's what we're diving into today, specifically that design and development stage. It's called A3, if you're following along with the Secure Development Lifecycle lingo.
SDL. Yes.
And our trusty guidebook for this deep dive is Practical Core Software Security. One thing it really emphasizes is that this A3 phase, it's not all just like hardcore tech stuff.
No, definitely not.
There's this whole other layer of aligning with a company's own policies, and then you've got industry regulations to think about, maybe even some legal hurdles to watch out for from the get-go.
It's much easier to sort all that out early. Imagine trying to fix a building code violation after, I don't know, they've already built the entire skyscraper.
Oof, not good. Much better to catch it when it's still on paper, right?
Exactly.
Now, our source material, it gets into this really interesting concept, the security test plan.
I've heard of those.
So it's kind of like, and I love this analogy, it's like coming up with a battle plan. But instead of for war, it's for how someone might try to hack your software.
Oh, interesting. So you're trying to find the weak points before someone with bad intentions does.
Exactly. And one method they talk about is called fuzz testing. Have you heard of that?
I have, but I wouldn't mind a refresher.
So basically, you're bombarding your software with just tons of random inputs.
Oh, a stress test almost.
Exactly. It's like plugging a bunch of different appliances into an outlet strip all at once. You want to see if anything, metaphorically speaking, of course, catches fire.
Always see where the system fails.
Exactly. And this whole testing thing reminded me of there's white box testing and then there's black box testing. Imagine trying to find your way out of a maze.
Okay, I can picture that.
So white box testing, having a map of the maze.
So you can see everything, how it's all connected.
Exactly. But then black box testing, that's like being blindfolded in the maze.
You just have to feel your way through.
And they both have their place, right?
Oh, for sure. With white box, you can really get in there and see how the code itself works.
Right. You're examining the blueprint.
Exactly. While black box is more about how would an actual user experience this software?
Without knowing all the behind-the-scenes stuff.
Precisely.
And this all kind of circles back to that threat modeling we've talked about before. So as the team's making decisions in this A3 phase, they have to keep going back to that threat model and asking, did that new feature we just added, did that accidentally open up a vulnerability?
We just gave away the metaphorical keys to the kingdom without realizing it.
Exactly. It's a moving target, this whole security thing.
It really is. And it takes a team effort. You've got developers, testers, security specialists, all have to be on the same page.
Working together.
Absolutely. To make sure this software is as secure as it can possibly be.
So we're not just building a digital fortress, right? It's about making sure that the blueprints themselves were secure from the very beginning.
The good foundation is key.
Exactly. And speaking of foundations, our trusty source material dives into get this, 11 principles of security by design.
11. That's pretty comprehensive.
Right. So these principles, they were developed by these guys, Salzer and Schroeder, and they're guidelines for making security right into the DNA of your software.
I like that. So instead of just putting bars on the windows afterwards, you're designing a house where you don't even need them.
Exactly. And one of these principles that really stood out to me is called least privilege.
I'm intrigued. What does that one entail?
So imagine you have a guest coming over to your house, right?
I'm picturing it.
And instead of giving them a key to your entire house, you just give them a key to the guest room.
Just access to what they need, nothing more.
Exactly. So by limiting access, you're minimizing the potential damage if, something were to happen.
Makes sense, less to compromise.
And that actually reminded me of another principle they mentioned, psychological acceptability. Have you heard of that one?
I can't say that I have.
So you could design the most secure system in the world, Fort Knox level security.
Right, impenetrable.
But if it's so complex or so user unfriendly,
people will just find a way around it.
Exactly. Or they'll just give up entirely. So it's about finding that balance.
Definitely. You want something that's secure, but also something that people can actually use.
Without pulling their hair out. And on that note of things user-friendly, our book brought up this idea of leveraging existing components, which basically means sometimes the best security tools
are already at your disposal.
Yes. You just have to know how to use them.
It's like having a toolbox full of top-of-the-line tools, but you only know how to use a hammer.
100%. But once you learn how to use all those tools and how they work together,
then you can build something truly remarkable and secure.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, I know we're throwing a lot of information out there, but it seems like catching these vulnerabilities early on
is absolutely crucial.
Right. So let's shift gears a bit and talk about another super important aspect of software design, especially in today's world:
And what's that?
privacy. It's such a big deal, right?
Mm.
Especially these days, building software that doesn't just like, it has to respect people's data.
Right. It's not just about functionality anymore. So how does this A3 phase actually address all that?
That's what I want to know.
Well, the key is you have to bake privacy into the design right from the start. It's not something you just like spawn at the end as an afterthought.
Okay. What does that look like in practice?
So during this A3 phase, the developers, they're thinking about privacy risks. They're figuring out what data they absolutely need to collect.
Because you don't always need everything, right?
Exactly. And then how are they going to store that data securely? Who should be able to access it? All these questions come into play.
So it's kind of like where to put security cameras in your house.
Oh, I like that analogy.
Right.
Yeah.
Like you want to cover the important areas, but you don't want it to feel like you're living in a surveillance state.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And to help developers figure all this out, there's actually, Microsoft has this really helpful documentation on privacy risk level.
Whoa. Okay.
And they break it down into this nice three-tier system.
So like medium and high risk.
Kind of use P1, P2, and P3.
Okay, what do those stand for?
So think of P1 as like high security vault.
Okay.
This is where you keep the crown jewels, so to speak.
The really important stuff.
Exactly. We're talking like security numbers, financial data, health records, stuff you really don't want getting out.
Definitely not.
The security around that P1 level data has to be top-notch. No exceptions.
Makes sense. So what about P2 then? What falls into that category?
P2, you could think of that more like a secure cabinet in your office. Still needs protection, but the stakes aren't quite as high.
Okay, less dire consequences if something goes wrong.
Right. We're talking maybe user's IP address, their browsing history, things like that.
Yeah. So not necessarily personally identifiable information on its own, but...
You could potentially use it to build a profile of their online activity.
Right, okay.
So it's still got to handle that data responsibly, even if it's not as sensitive as P1.
Totally. And what about P3? Is that like the open filing cabinet?
Pretty much. P3 is your low privacy risk stuff. Not considered personally identifiable, doesn't pose a significant threat.
Okay, so give me an example of that.
Sure. Let's say the date a user created their account, or what language preference they selected.
Okay, not exactly information that's going to keep someone up at night.
Exactly. But the point is, even though all data deserves some level of protection, you want to allocate your resources appropriately.
Right. So you're not spending all your time guarding the open filing cabinet.
Precisely. And one thing Microsoft stresses across all three levels, and this is really important, is transparency.
Okay, tell me more about that.
No matter what, users should always know how their data is being used. Whether it's P1, P2, or P3, it doesn't matter. Transparency is key.
It builds trust, right?
Exactly. Nobody wants to feel like their information is being collected and used in the dark. Be upfront about your practices. Users are more likely to trust you if they know what's going on.
It just makes sense. So we've covered a lot here. From threat modeling to these privacy risk levels, what are some of the big takeaways from all this A3 stuff?
I think the biggest takeaway is that this A3 phase, it's really about weaving security and privacy into the very fabric of the software from the ground up.
Like not an add-on.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Got to be part of the DNA of the software itself.
And we talked about all those different methods, like security testing, right? Almost like the software, a bunch of stress tests, seeing what it can handle.
Right. Find the weak points before someone else does.
Exactly. And then there were those 11 principles of security by design. I mean, a lot.
It's comprehensive.
Yeah.
That's the point, right? You want to think of everything.
Are we building a house here, or are we building Fort Knox?
Well, ideally, a bit of both.
Right. And that actually reminds me, we talked about psychological acceptability too, which is so important because I feel like we've all run into those security measures that are just like so top.
That you end up just bypassing them altogether because it's too much of a hassle.
Yes, exactly. So it's got to be user-friendly too. It's like point of having this super secure system if nobody can even use it.
Exactly. It's about finding that balance. You want something that is both secure and usable.
100%. And speaking of usability, we can't forget about privacy. That was a big part of our conversation today, especially with those risk levels that Microsoft uses, P1, P2, P3.
It's a good system for thinking about how to handle different types of data because not all data is created equal.
Right. Like some things need to be locked down tight and other things maybe not so much.
Exactly. But no matter what, being transparent with users, that's crucial.
Because in the end, it all comes down to trust, right? Users need to be able to trust that the software they're using is safe, that it's secure, that their data is being protected.
It's about building that foundation of trust, not just between users and developers, but in the technology itself. Because this stuff, it's not going away.
If anything, it's only going to become more important as technology continues to evolve.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground today in our deep dive into secure software development. Hopefully this has given you a good overview of what it takes to build software that is both functional and secure.
And maybe spark some of your own questions about this whole world of security and privacy.
Exactly. Like, what are your thoughts on facial recognition software? Or, how do we protect privacy as AI gets more and more sophisticated?
Keep those questions coming.
Exactly. Stay curious, stay informed, and we'll see you next time.